There's a place in North America where a swampy river mouth became the busiest rail hub on Earth in under a century. Where a fire that lasted barely 36 hours cleared the ground for one of the greatest building booms in human history. Where a single street corner can tell you the story of jazz, of gangsters, of civil rights, of physics, and of the first black president of the United States. That place is Chicago. This is not a story about a city that was destined for greatness. It's a story about mud, money, ambition, fire, blood, music, and reinvention, over and over again. Let's walk through 250 years on the shore of Lake Michigan. Before the city, 1770s to 1830s, long before anyone called it Chicago, this land belonged to the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, along with the Miami, Ho-Chunk, and other indigenous peoples who had lived, traded, and traveled through this region for centuries. The name itself comes from an Algonquian word, Shikakwa, referring to the wild garlic or onion that grew in abundance along the marshy riverbanks. This was not empty land. It was a crossroads, a short portage connecting the Great Lakes watershed to the Mississippi River system, which made it one of the most strategically important pieces of geography on the continent. The first permanent non-indigenous settler here was a man named Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, a black French-Haitian trader who arrived sometime in the 1780s and built a farm and trading post near the mouth of the Chicago River. Du Sable ran a successful operation, a house, barn, mill, bakehouse, and dairy, trading furs, grain, and goods with indigenous nations and European settlers alike. He is now formally recognized as the founder of Chicago, a fact the city itself ignored for nearly 2 centuries before finally honoring him properly in modern times. In 1803, the U.S. Army built Fort Dearborn at the river's mouth, a small outpost meant to project American power into the western frontier. It didn't last. In 1812, during the war with Britain, the fort's garrison attempted to evacuate and was attacked by Potawatomi warriors in what became known as the Fort Dearborn Massacre, a bloody episode rooted in broken treaties and encroaching settlement. The fort was rebuilt in 1816, but the underlying story of this era is the same story playing out across the entire American frontier. Indigenous nations were pushed out through treaties signed under pressure and outright forced removal to make way for settlers who saw the swampy little outpost as the future gateway to the West. By the 1830s, that vision was starting to look real. The federal government began pushing the last major indigenous nations out of the region through treaties like the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, which forced the Council of the Three Fires to cede their remaining lands here. Chicago incorporated as a town that same year with fewer than 400 residents. 4 years later, in 1837, it incorporated as a city. Nobody at that moment could have imagined what was coming. The engine of the West, 1830s to 1871. Chicago's rise was not an accident of geography alone. It was built on infrastructure. In 1848, the Illinois and Michigan Canal opened, finally linking Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River system, and through it to the Port of New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. That same year, Chicago's first railroad began operating. It was a modest 10 miles of track. It would not stay modest for long. Over the next 2 decades, Chicago transformed into the undisputed rail capital of the United States. Trains from the East Coast terminated here. Trains heading west, north, and south originated here. Almost nothing moved across the American interior without touching Chicago first. Grain from the prairies flowed into the city and out through its new Board of Trade, founded in 1848, which standardized grain grading and futures trading in ways that still shape commodity markets today. Lumber from Wisconsin and Michigan piled up along the riverbanks, making Chicago the largest lumber market in the world for a stretch of the 19th century. And then there was meat. In 1865, the Union Stockyards opened on the city's south side, consolidating the chaotic patchwork of smaller stockyards into a single, enormous operation. Cattle, hogs, and sheep, arrived by the trainload from across the Midwest, were slaughtered and processed by an increasingly industrialized workforce and shipped out as dressed meat thanks to innovations like the refrigerated railcar. Chicago earned the nickname "Hog Butcher for the World," a phrase later immortalized by poet Carl Sandburg. The stockyards would employ tens of thousands of workers, many of them immigrants, in conditions so brutal that they later inspired Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. This was also an era of staggering immigration. Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Germans fleeing political upheaval, and later waves of Poles, Czechs, Italians, and Scandinavians poured into the city, building distinct neighborhoods that still bear their imprint today. By 1870, Chicago's population had exploded past 300,000. A city that had barely existed 40 years earlier was now one of the largest in the nation. All of this, the wooden buildings, the wooden sidewalks, the packed tenements, the dry summer, was setting the stage for catastrophe. The Great Fire and the Rebirth, 1871 to 1893. On the night of October 8, 1871, a fire broke out on the property of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary on the city's west side. The popular legend blames a cow kicking over a lantern in the O'Leary barn, a story almost certainly invented by a journalist and never substantiated. Whatever the true spark, the fire found a city built almost entirely of wood, baked dry by a summer drought, and it spread with terrifying speed. By the time rain finally helped extinguish it on October 10th, the Great Chicago Fire had killed an estimated 300 people, destroyed roughly 17,000 buildings, and left about 100,000 residents, a third of the city's population, homeless. The business district was almost completely leveled. What happened next is the real story. Rather than collapsing, Chicago rebuilt with astonishing speed and ambition. New fire codes demanded masonry and stone construction downtown. Architects and engineers descended on the city to take advantage of cheap land and a blank slate, and Chicago became the birthplace of a genuinely new form of building, the skyscraper. In 1885, the home insurance building rose in the Loop, using a load-bearing steel frame instead of thick masonry walls, widely considered the world's first true skyscraper. Architects like William LeBaron Jenney, Louis Sullivan, and Daniel Burnham pioneered what came to be called the Chicago School of Architecture, prioritizing steel frames, large plate glass windows, and Sullivan's famous principle that form follows function. Chicago's confidence reached its peak in 1893 with the World's Columbian Exposition, a massive World's Fair held to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. A year late, but nobody seemed to mind. Daniel Burnham led the design of the fairgrounds, creating the gleaming neoclassical white city that dazzled roughly 27 million visitors. The fair introduced the world to the Ferris wheel, built specifically to rival the Eiffel Tower, and showcased new technologies like alternating current electricity, courtesy of Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. For a city that had been in ashes just 22 years earlier, it was an extraordinary statement. Chicago had not just recovered, it had become a symbol of American industrial might and modern urban possibility. But beneath the gleaming fairgrounds, the city's growth was creating enormous tension. Labor, machines, and migration, 1880s to 1920s, Chicago's industrial boom was built on the backs of workers who often labored in dangerous conditions for meager wages, and the city became a flashpoint for the American labor movement. In May 1886, workers across Chicago and the country were striking for an 8-hour workday. On May 4th, a labor rally at Haymarket Square turned violent when someone threw a bomb at police, who responded with gunfire into the crowd. Several police officers and an unknown number of civilians died. In the aftermath, 8 labor activists were convicted in a trial widely criticized as unjust, and 4 were executed. The Haymarket affair became a global touchstone for the labor movement, and is part of the reason May Day is celebrated as International Workers' Day around the world. Chicago's political life during this period was also being shaped by a rising machine, a network of ward bosses, patronage jobs, and favor trading that would define the city's governance for the next century. This system could deliver services and jobs efficiently to immigrant communities, but it also entrenched corruption and cronyism as fundamental features of how the city operated. Starting around 1910 and accelerating dramatically after World War I, Chicago became one of the primary destinations of the Great Migration, the mass movement of Black Americans out of the rural South, fleeing Jim Crow segregation and seeking industrial jobs in northern cities. Hundreds of thousands of Black Southerners arrived in Chicago over the following decades, transforming the South Side into a vibrant cultural and economic center, particularly the neighborhood known as Bronzeville, which became one of the most important hubs of Black business, journalism, and culture in the entire country. This migration also brought an explosion of musical innovation. Chicago became a crucial home for jazz, as musicians from New Orleans, including a young Louis Armstrong, relocated north and helped define what became known as Chicago-style jazz in the 1920s. Decades later, in the mid-20th century, the city would do it again with the blues, as Delta blues musicians electrified their sound in Chicago's clubs and recording studios, creating the foundation for what the world knows as Chicago blues, a sound that would directly influence rock and roll. Racial tension accompanying this rapid demographic shift also boiled over violently. In the summer of 1919, a period of nationwide racial violence known as Red Summer, Chicago experienced a brutal race riot sparked by the drowning of a Black teenager who had drifted into a segregated swimming area at a beach on Lake Michigan. Days of violence left dozens dead and hundreds injured, exposing deep fault lines in the city that would persist for generations. Prohibition, Capone, and the myth of Gangland, Chicago, 1920s to 1930s. No history of Chicago is complete without confronting the era that gave the city its most enduring, if unwelcome, global reputation. When Prohibition banned alcohol nationwide in 1920, it created a massive black market, and Chicago's existing networks of political corruption, immigrant gangs, and organized crime were perfectly positioned to exploit it. Al Capone rose through this underworld to become the most notorious gangster in American history, controlling a bootlegging empire that generated enormous profits while operating with the tacit protection of corrupt police and politicians. The violence peaked in the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when men dressed as police officers executed 7 members of a rival gang in a garage on the North Side, a killing that shocked the nation and cemented Chicago's gangland image in popular culture for decades to come. Capone's downfall came not through a murder charge, but through tax evasion, as federal authorities used financial investigation to finally take him down in 1931. But the association between Chicago and organized crime had already been sealed into the public imagination, an image the city has spent nearly a century trying to balance against its other, more constructive achievements. Those achievements continued even through the hardship of the Great Depression. In 1933, Chicago hosted another World's Fair, the Century of Progress Exposition, celebrating the city's centennial and showcasing new technologies and modernist design even as the country struggled economically. Science, war, and the post-war boom, 1940s to 1960s. Chicago's next great historical moment arrived quietly, underground, on a squash court beneath the stands of the University of Chicago's football stadium. On December 2, 1942, a team led by physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the world's first controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, a breakthrough that was a critical step toward the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. Chicago, in this way, played a foundational and often underappreciated role in the dawn of the nuclear age. After World War II, Chicago entered a long post-war boom alongside the rest of urban America. Manufacturing remained strong, the population continued to grow, and new waves of migration, including large numbers of Mexican, Puerto Rican, and continuing Black Southern migrants, reshaped the city's neighborhoods once again. This era was dominated politically by Mayor Richard J. Daley, who took office in 1955 and would run the city for the next 21 years as perhaps the most powerful local political boss in modern American history. Daley modernized Chicago's infrastructure, championed massive building projects, including O'Hare International Airport's expansion into the world's busiest airport, and cemented the Democratic machine's total control over city government. But his tenure was also marked by deep controversy, particularly around housing segregation, urban renewal projects that displaced Black communities, and his administration's harsh handling of protests. That tension exploded onto the world stage in 1968. In April, riots broke out on the West Side following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Then in August, the city hosted the Democratic National Convention, where anti-war protesters clashed violently with Chicago police outside the convention hall in scenes broadcast on national television that a federal commission later characterized as a police riot. For a generation of Americans, 1968 Chicago became shorthand for a nation coming apart at the seams. Decline, grit, and reinvention, 1970s to 1990s. Like much of America's industrial heartland, Chicago faced serious economic headwinds starting in the 1970s. Manufacturing jobs disappeared as factories closed or moved overseas. The Union Stockyards, once the beating industrial heart of the city, finally closed for good in 1971, after over a century of operation. Population declined as residents moved to the suburbs, a pattern known as white flight that also deepened racial and economic segregation within the city itself. Neighborhoods on the south and west sides, hit hardest by disinvestment, struggled with poverty, crime, and the long-term consequences of discriminatory housing policies like redlining. Yet Chicago also produced remarkable moments of civic transformation during this period. In 1983, Harold Washington was elected as the city's first Black mayor, a landmark victory achieved through a broad coalition of Black, Latino, and progressive white voters that challenged the old machine politics head-on. His time in office was defined by fierce political battles with the old guard on the city council, but it represented a genuine turning point in who held power in Chicago. The city's skyline also kept climbing even as its economy shifted. The Sears Tower, completed in 1973, became the tallest building in the world at the time, a title it held for roughly 2 decades, and a symbol that Chicago still had ambitions of scale even during difficult years. Meanwhile, the city's cultural output kept flowing outward into the world. Chicago-style house music emerged from the city's clubs in the 1980s and became one of the most influential genres in the history of electronic dance music, echoing the way jazz and blues had once traveled outward from these same streets decades before. Modern Chicago, 1990s to today. Richard M. Daley, son of the earlier mayor, took office in 1989 and led the city for over 2 decades, overseeing a period often described as a Chicago Renaissance. Downtown was revitalized. Millennium Park opened in 2004, featuring Anish Kapoor's now iconic reflective sculpture, nicknamed The Bean. And the city worked hard to rebrand itself as a global business, culture, and tourism destination, rather than simply a Rust Belt manufacturing town. Chicago's most famous resident of this era, of course, was a young community organizer and law professor named Barack Obama, who built his political career on the South Side before being elected to the U.S. Senate and, in 2008, becoming the first black president of the United States. His election night celebration in Grant Park, watched by hundreds of thousands in person and millions more around the world, became one of the defining images of Chicago in the 21st century, a city once scarred by the 1968 convention riots, now serving as the backdrop for what many saw as a historic step forward. Chicago today remains a city of profound contrasts. It is home to world-class universities, a globally respected architecture scene that continues to attract visitors eager to take river cruises past buildings by Mies van der Rohe and Gangland, a food culture that gave the world deep dish pizza and the Chicago-style hot dog, and a lakefront that stretches for miles as genuinely public, undeveloped park space, a rarity among major American cities. It also continues to grapple with serious challenges: persistent gun violence concentrated in historically disinvested neighborhoods, deep economic and racial segregation, whose roots trace directly back to 20th century housing policy, and the fiscal strain of pension obligations built up over decades of machine-era governance. In 2019, Lori Lightfoot became the city's first black woman and first openly gay mayor, continuing a long pattern of Chicago's political leadership, reflecting, however imperfectly, the diversity of the city itself. 250 years ago, this was marshland at a portage between two watersheds, home to indigenous nations who had thrived here for generations before a French-Haitian trader named Sable built a farm at the river's mouth. From that beginning, Chicago grew into the railroad hub of a continent, burned to the ground, rebuilt itself into the birthplace of the skyscraper, gave the world jazz and blues and house music, split atoms beneath a football stadium, survived gangland violence and political corruption and racial upheaval, and eventually sent one of its own to the White House. Chicago has never been a city defined by a single identity. It has been a boomtown, a slaughterhouse, a laboratory, a battlefield, and a dance floor, sometimes all at once. Its history is not a straight line of progress. It is a city that has had to reinvent itself again and again, often through crisis, and has somehow always found a way to keep building. That, more than any single building or fire or fair, might be the real story of Chicago.